Here's another example that is not in the code book, and it's a pregnant patient. And I'm not going to get into this too deeply because to me the OB, the coding of pregnancy and pregnancy-related conditions, is one of the more difficult chapters in the ICD-10-CM code book. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I just wanted to make you aware that there is a very specific guideline that relates to a pregnant patient having the malignant neoplasm. You will learn when you get to this chapter, is chapter 15 in the code book, that the week of gestation is always reported for any patient in the hospital who is pregnant. At the very beginning of the chapter 15 codes, there is a little table that tells you how the weeks correspond to the trimester, and week 29 is the third trimester, so that Z3A.29 is her weeks of gestation. I know I'm jumping ahead, but that just explains to you where that comes from. There's no guideline about that that I'm aware of. Is in the code book, actually, that gives you that direction. There is a guideline for malignant neoplasm in a pregnant patient, and this tells us to use the O, that's not a 0, the O9A.113 code. The O9A category is at the very end of chapter 15 in the code book. I'll show you that in a moment. So we're going to use that code as our principal because chapter 15 codes, the pregnancy or OB codes, always are principal. They are always I shouldn't say always, they are most often your principal. There's a very few instances where they're not. And then we're going to identify the cancer. That's our C50.912. And then, of course, our Z code indicating our weeks of gestation. The table of neoplasm, if you look up breast, you get the C50.9-, meaning additional characters are needed. We're going to assign that character with her left breast being those extra characters. And let's see. I'm not going to spend much time looking up this pregnancy code because that will come later. I just want you to just primarily be aware of the fact that there is a guideline specific to a malignant neoplasm in a pregnant patient. Here's another exercise not in your coding handbook. The patient is admitted for a pathological fracture of L4-5, initial encounter, due to bone cancer. Treatment during this stay will focus on the treatment of the pathological fracture. That documentation is important because our coding guidelines tell us that the sequencing is dependent on the focus of treatment when you have a pathological fracture due to a neoplasm. Your pathway is here on the slide. Fracture, pathological, is your main term, with subterms due to, neoplastic disease, vertebrae. Takes you to M84.58. When you go to the tabular, you see that there is a 7th character needed. We know the initial encounter is our 7th character, so we need a placeholder X in the 6th character position, and that indicates that pathological fracture. It's the principal because our focus of treatment during this encounter is the treatment of that pathological fracture, and the cancer is there because that's the reason why he has this pathological fracture. Here's another example, the same example, however this time the focus is on the bone cancer, not the fracture. So all we do is inverted our codes, so now our cancer diagnosis is our primary code, and the vertebrae fracture, the T5-6 fractures, are the secondary code in this case. And here's another exercise not in the coding handbook that's very common in the hospitals, and that is when you have an anemia associated with the malignancy. If the patient is admitted for treatment of the anemia associated with acute monocytic leukemia, you're going to sequence the malignancy as the principal, followed by the code for the anemia as your secondary code. And here I have the pathway is primary term is anemia, or main term is anemia, in, which can also mean due to or with, neoplastic disease. Remember that terms in parentheses are non-essential modifiers. It wouldn't have to say that, but it might say that. Then your acute monocytic leukemia. In the alphabetical index, leukemia is your main term, with subterm acute monocytic, and that takes you to C93.0. Additional characters are needed. You look up the C93.0 in your tabular, and that gives you your fifth character 0. I'm not going to spend as much time going back and forth between the alphabetical index and the tabular unless I get more questions, because these podcasts just get so long. I'm trying to be a little more efficient with that. The next exercise, not in the coding handbook, is the patient is admitted for treatment of anemia caused by chemotherapy for the treatment of bladder cancer. We have a guideline that directly addresses anemia associated with chemo. And here we go. It's coding guideline 1C2C2. When the admission is for management of anemia associated with an adverse effect of the administration of chemo or immunotherapy, and the only treatment is for the anemia code is sequenced first, followed by the malignancy codes and the adverse effect code. So we see the T45.1X5 is already given to us as one of the codes that we're going to use. We also have the anemia code here, and here's your cancer code for bladder cancer. So here's your anemia code. The pathway is anemia due to anti-neoplastic chemo, D64.81. Note the excludes one note. Anemia in neoplastic disease and anemia due to anti-neoplastic chemo are two different things, two different codes. Note the excludes one note, that anemia in neoplastic disease and anemia due to anti-neoplastic chemo are two different things, two different codes. Table of neoplasms, using that for our bladder cancer, we see in the malignant primary column C67.9 is the code for the bladder cancer. And if we were looking up, we have been given in our guideline the T45 code, but I also wanted to show you it is in the table of drugs and chemicals. If you look up anti-neoplastic under the substance column and then your adverse column, you find this. I think we'll go to the code book and look at that one. And I have it highlighted in my book because I look at it quite often. Go back up here. Here's your substance, and then all the way over here is your adverse effect column. It's the next to last column. So we're going to go back down to anti-neoplastic. We aren't given the specific chemo this person is using, so we're going to go across here to your adverse effects column, and this is where our guideline gets that T45.1X5 as the adverse effect code. T45.1X, adverse effect of anti-neoplastic and immunosuppressive drugs. 7 characters are needed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and our 7th character would be our encounter, which in this case is initial. Just as a reminder of this, if we go to the front of this chapter, this is chapter 19, and if we go to the very beginning of our T45 category, we see instructional notes here that the appropriate 7th character has to be added to each code from category T45, with A being our initial encounter, D subsequent, and S sequela. Our medical record documentation told us it is initial encounter, so our 7th character is A for this T45 code. One last thing, I want you to be mindful that the exercises in the PowerPoints don't address all of the guidelines. However, our exams can address all those guidelines. So please don't just study what we're doing in our exercises, but study all of the guidelines, knowing when you might apply them. Follow your assignment schedule with regard to the specific chapter assignments through the semester. That way you can stay on top of it. If you have any questions, please post your question in the discussion board, and I will attempt to answer it for everyone. and I hope you have a good day. Take care.